friend. I'm Hindol Sengupta. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome an old friend, Professor Subhash Kak. Professor Subhash Kak, Padma Shri Professor Subhash Kak, should I say, is a computer engineer, a scientist, but he spent his entire lifetime deep into Indian or Indic knowledge systems. He understands many of the critical texts. He understands their relevance in the world of machines and technology, and he understands how all of this comes together for a very Indian perspective. Professor Subhash Kak, thanks very much for your time.
Thank you, Hindol. Glad to be on your show once again after many years.
Thank you, Professor. Always a pleasure talking to you. Professor Kak, let me begin by asking you this. Last time you and I spoke, I was still in the UK, and AI wasn't as big as it is today. ChatGPT hadn't come into pass, nor had Bing.com and Copilot and all this Mid-Journey and all the million other things, right? But we did, even at that time, talk a little bit about the impact of AI on free will. Let's pick up the conversation from there, Professor. Today, when you look at the way AI is impacting, careers, businesses, economies, and also human decision-making abilities, talk to us a little bit about the notion of free will in what is now firmly the age of AI.
Let me respond first of all by telling you that 3-4 months ago, and this is something that I've been talking about or considering for a long time as a researcher in AI and as somebody who's also into philosophy, the whole question of where do you bring in free will? If we are all machines, then none of us could have free will. And this is something that psychologists and neuroscientists in the West have also been considering. And there's a very famous paper that was written about 50 years ago by a professor named Benjamin Libet. And he did experiment on how does your decision to press a button, for example, how does it mirror itself in your brain? So these experiments were done on subjects who were being, whose skull had been opened up because they were doing certain brain surgery was being done. And what was discovered was that even before, a few hundred milliseconds before you think you have consciously made a decision, the electrical activity in the motor cortex corresponding to your finger, which you're supposed to press, already begins, which means you might imagine that you have free will, but in reality, you don't. In reality, all those decisions have already been made by the environment, by your inner state, and so on. Okay, so this has been a big strand of thought in academic discourse right now. Are we sure what is free will? But this is one element. The second element is that 3-4 months ago, I published a paper which is called No-Go Theorems in Machine Consciousness, which I believe is quite an important paper, where I show that a machine will never be conscious, never be conscious, which goes against the mainstream view that consciousness arises out of the complexity of the interconnections of the neurons inside the brain. Because if it's a product of complexity, then a machine complexity will also lead to consciousness. So these theorems, I have 4 theorems in this paper, say that machines will never be conscious, which means that consciousness is not material, which is precisely what Vedanta says, which is precisely what the Bhagavad Gita, the Upanishads, or the Brahma Sutras say, that Atma is not material. It's not a part of the sharir, right? It resides within. It's transcendent. It's not something which resides. It's not material which resides within you. It's transcendent. Or in Sanskrit, it's para. Okay. Now, okay, so with all this as background, I think the Indian knowledge system view or the Vedantic view on free will is the correct one, because that squares up with my new paper, which incidentally, all your viewers can get a copy of. I just posted it on my academia.edu page, which people can download free. So this, what it means is we are each human being is a product of forces around, and we keep on reacting. So it's a karmic chain. We're not free. Accepting at such moment when you are one with this transcendent consciousness, which in the Bhagavad Gita, Vasudev, you might say it's Vasudev, it's Krishna, or in the Shaivite tradition, you say it's Shiva, or whatever name you want to give it, right? So it's only then that you are free, and counterintuitively or paradoxically, you are free when you are part of a cosmic flow. That's when you are sort of midstream. Normally, you think you're free when you are a kind of an eddy on a bank, a river, and the eddy keeps on going down. It's like the vrittis that Patanjali speaks about in his Yoga Sutras. And I believe this is how you can explain how creativity occurs. Creativity occurs when you are one with this consciousness within you. Now, every person has this consciousness, and this consciousness is like light, uh, which falls on the contents of the mind. Mind and brain identity you can assert at a certain level. So, and this is in contrast to what the Western tradition says. The mainstream Western tradition, mind is consciousness. In the Indian tradition, consciousness is transcendent. But mind is an instrument which is energized by this light. But even though it's energized, it's not in control of itself. It's like the image of the chariot in the Bhagavad Gita or in the Kathopanishad, where each individual is the horses, which are the senses. And finally, the intellect is the charioteer, but but that intellect is itself is being pushed, driven by wherever the horses are taking. Unless the intellect is able to transcend and see that witness sitting next to him, Krishna or Shiva, and ultimately realize that that jivatma, which one normally is, the complex of one's memories and drives, is really beyond that, is that Paramatma. So I think it all hangs together. It hangs together whether you look at it from the perspective of psychology, from the perspective of computer science, or if you look at Mandukya Upanishad, there are 4 states of awareness, and the dream state is where creativity comes from, Hiranya Garbha, because there you're not constrained by the box in which we are normally situated, the box related to daily things, people around us, expectations, which constrain us. You really cannot be creative. And that's why, there are so many accounts of creative people in all fields, poets or scientists or writers or inventors. Literally all the time, they say that our idea came to us spontaneously. We were in a trance, or I was dreaming. We don't know where it came from. Or in the case of Ramanujan, well, in my lucid dreams, the goddess Namagiri, and you can give the name goddess to this light that goddess dictated these formulas to me. So I think this is the most revolutionary idea which is going to transform the world. It's universal. It's, of course, connected to the Indian tradition. We shouldn't be proud of it because that's just an accident. All of humanity is one. All people get the same, it's the same consciousness. But I think, especially in a world where unprecedented pressures arise, due to collapsing population, due to the fact that women don't want to have children because they can now choose not to have children. And so the question of what do you live for, that's when this whole inner world opens up, that Hiranyagarbha that we spoke about, and where that opens up to each individual, as in Sri Ramakrishna's case, his whole personal story, or in Vivekananda's case, or anybody who's been in this path. Because what is that path? That path, just like you have the shiny city on the mountain, which is the outer city, which is often used, that image is used to make people follow them. Here you come there and you'll get all these riches. There is a shiny city within, available to every individual. So I think the next centuries would be all about it. And in the beginning, it'll open up to those cultures and communities which have, for various historical reasons, shut themselves up from this light and said, we are only bodies and we must only worry about pleasures of the body in this world or thereafter. It's again about pleasures of the body, right? You have paradise and you do this or do that. To something where you have unimaginable fulfillment available here, because the thereafter exists now. There's only this moment, and that moment also contains paradise. So I think this is going to be transforming the whole world. And at some point, we'll also become compassionate enough to see how we can relate to animals themselves, because they also have the same light. Of course, they don't have the same brain capacity, but they have the same feelings of love and affection as anybody who has pets is aware of, or even transcendent thing of empathy, of altruism. We know animals have altruism also. So I see this as being of extraordinary importance.
This is a fascinating explanation, Professor Kak. I want to ask you, David Chalmers and others talked about a hard problem of consciousness, right? The explanation that you just gave seems to move that conversation forward. But many still argue, like Daniel Dennett famously argued that, there is no such thing as consciousness. It doesn't really exist. Now, where are we moving in that direction of trying to understand what consciousness really is? Is the combination of technology and the advancement of our understanding of Indian knowledge systems today, especially with the coming of AI tools, enabling us to understand or go forward in our own comprehension of what consciousness really is?
Chalmers, of course, points out, okay, where does this subjective sense emerge? And that's what, in his view, was the hard problem. Or Dennett, who passed away just a couple of months ago, I believe, that there is no such thing. And maybe in a certain sense, consciousness is not a thing. To that extent, it's true. When Western philosophers say, hey, what do you mean by it? Because it's not a thing. That's what Vedanta says. It's not a thing. It's para. It's a state that you get into, but it's not a thing. It could not be a thing, because if it were a thing, then it would have properties. Then you would be able to examine it. You can't examine it because it's the light which illuminates your mind. I think where science stands right now, no matter whether you look at it from the perspective of computer science, because there the question is, will AI ultimately lead to consciousness? And I argued in my papers recently, especially this most recent one, which appeared in the Journal of AI and Consciousness, which I think is extremely important, that computers will never be conscious for a variety of reasons, including, in fact, I can summarize one argument very quickly. If consciousness was a product of complexity, you can construct a machine of sufficient complexity. And now you can say that suddenly consciousness arises there. But now this machine itself could be a part of larger machine of a larger complexity. Then you'll have a paradox that a conscious being would be a part of another conscious being. But consciousness is one, is a unity. And that's why this is impossible. That's why complexity cannot lead to consciousness, right? So, okay, you have a problem from the perspective of from computer science. From neuroscience, where does the experiencing self reside inside the brain? Neuroscience imaging has not been able to localize any particular point in the brain where the self resides, because it doesn't reside anywhere. From the perspective of psychology as well. And where the West has gotten stuck is because, as I mentioned earlier, although the greatest minds in the West are perfectly in agreement with Vedantic ideas, like the pioneers of quantum mechanics or the best thinkers in psychology, including my late friend who passed away a few years ago, named Carl Pribram, who was a very well-known neuroscientist. Uh, they all accept Vedantic ideas, that this is the only way you can make sense of reality. Because what we are talking about is reality. Two aspects, the outer and the inner. And they're both two sides of the same coin, as in quantum mechanics, the observer and the observed. You cannot explain the observer from the perspective of the observed. So given all of that, the academic and the more popular, um, discussions of all of this, which will have fundamental um, repercussions for society, because these are the guys who decide how education should be done, for example, or the kind of ideas which are planted through magazines, etc., about what people should aspire for. If you think you are nothing but the body, then the stories that you'll read in Vogue or in other magazines would be, well, okay, this is what I should do with my body. In fact, there's some horrific stories which you will see even in teen Vogue about what people should do for pleasuring themselves. It's only about pleasuring themselves. But if you accepted some other higher reality, then you might go from the current education paradigm in America, where kids are left wild, and then when they grow up, they don't know how to control themselves, to probably the Japanese model, where the children are given more agency and they are taught to respect each other, which I think the West also needs. If you look at from the perspective of, okay, here we are in the post-industrial world with this fraught relationship, let's say, between the East and the West. Maybe the West ought to learn something from the East. Maybe there needs to be, even without going into abstract Vedanta, maybe there should be more focus on reflection, self-reflection, which American schools don't do, and that's why these kids are not able to be as effective when they grow up.
These were the impacts, as we were discussing, one on, of course, the idea of free will, the notion of free will, and of course, later on, as you pointed out, very significant questions about pedagogy, including, pedagogical, formulae or frameworks used at a school level. Let's zoom out a little bit, Professor, and look at a sort of societal level. There was a little bit of a euphoric moment a few years ago where it seemed like Indian ideas were finally breaking into the West, right? Now, once again, we see a pushback from the, hard right and the hard left in the West, which, which seems to be, one wants to take yoga and make it beer yoga. The other says yoga is is essentially a sort of cloaked nationalist idea rising from India, to push its own nationalist ideals. In this process, the fundamental core ideas which are universal in the Indic knowledge systems seems to get buried and polarized in everyday politics. But there are breakout moments happening. I recently met, for instance, people from Argentina who told me that Sri Sri's movement, the art of living, is one of the biggest social movements in Argentina, perhaps after India, This Argentina is the country where Art of Living has the most number of followers, which is astounding. So there is also a breakthrough moment that's happening. Talk to us a little bit about this dichotomy, and where do you see the path forward for the universalization of Indic ideas or Indian ideas? We are never going to do what the Chinese do, right? Create Confucius, institutes everywhere. Ours has to be a process of a more sort of organic dissemination. But how is that working?
Well, the pushback will always be there. The Indic tradition itself recognizes it. There's always these two dichotomous forces, Asuric and Daivik. Asuric are body-centric, and Daivik are more consciousness-centric. And that manthan must always take place. The churning must always take place. And I think what's happening in the West is that churning. And that pushback is a good thing because that pushback helps those who are centered. Because, as Chandogya Upanishad or other Upanishads say, a human must be centered, be able to relate between the Asuric aspect of us, which we cannot deny, and the Daivic aspect of us as well. So, what this pushback does is to help us hone our message or to refashion it in many different ways, which is what needs to be done. Because otherwise, what happens is that, eh, often yoga teachers are not very sophisticated. And the reason why that's happened is after 47, we turned our back to Indic knowledge, to our own knowledge system, right? And how did India survive? These were people who grew up in villages and they became teachers of yoga in Scandinavia or Central Europe or in Argentina or elsewhere. And they're smart, they've got great sense or intuition, but maybe they didn't have all the language that you needed, sophisticated language that you needed to create a message so that academics in the West would have properly sensed it or properly accepted it. So I think what's really going on is a process, a natural process and a necessary process. And one element of that process is that India has to, first of all, more completely accept it as a part of universal knowledge. Yoga and the Vedas are a part of universal knowledge. But our curriculum doesn't give it. And therefore, a lot of Indians, in fact, a lot of resistance is from India itself. And these may be well-meaning people, but when whatever they read in college had no element of it, they think that it's all made up, or they think this is hallucination of one kind or the other. So I think as things change in India, as people study it in a sensible way and in a way which is also skeptical in a certain sense, you've got to keep on pushing it. That churning means pushing it. And also, young people by nature are more connected to the body, to the outer view, which is perfectly legitimate, perfectly fine. So bring it from out in. So as that happens, I think there will be, a more organic acceptance of it elsewhere as well. And the argument could be made that the Sanatan way, the eternal way, or Hinduism is really yoga, because of the six darshanas, five darshanas are analytical. The sixth, which is yoga, is synthetic. It's about life. It's about what a person does for self-knowledge. And yoga is really everywhere, no matter where you go. Now, some people may want to redefine it or say, well, this is nothing but calisthenics, which Krishnamacharya learned from some English band masters or whatever. These are things. This is like gossip. People can say whatever they want, but it's unstoppable. It's like the rise of India. Rise of yoga is unstoppable. And as you probably know, yoga has become a compulsory subject in schools and colleges in Saudi Arabia. So why? Because ultimately, if you are able to explain what it is, people would want to be a part of it. And if a lot of people are not into it, it's because it's our fault. We haven't explained what it is. And I think we need to also go away from the empty statements of the kind that we used to make, is that all paths are the same. Or that makes nothing. That's an empty statement. Yoga is a very definite path. And there are, of course, different kinds of yoga. Or you could be focused on asanas at a certain point. But ultimately, all learning and searching is yoga. Yoga is the coming together of the inner and the outer, union, yoking of the inner and the outer.
Let's go back to what you were talking about a little earlier, Professor, because I'm very keen to understand this. You spoke about mental health. This came up in our conversation. You also spoke about how, for instance, certain attributes of woke behavior, combined with all kinds of other sort of problems in society, are throwing many societies and many cultures off gear, so to speak. And in fact, sometimes when one sees some of the sort of you know younger politics in many parts of the world, one realizes that there is something that is going dramatically wrong. This is not just a response to a world event, which is absolutely legitimate. This is something deeper. This is a deeper expression of an emptiness that perhaps many young people feel, and not just young people, many older people also feel. Now, there is you and I both agree that there is a legitimate gap and a glaring gap that Indian knowledge systems, like the study of the Upanishads, study of the Vedanta, and the Vedas, of course, this, including, and why should we take that off the table, including the practice of some very simple rituals which could have a deep impact in people's lives, including, of course, you mentioned yoga. Now, talk to us a little bit about how this addresses one of the primary crises that we are facing, that of mental health. The mental health pandemic, and one must call it that now, is spreading around the world. In India, it's less spoken of than it perhaps should be. Of course, it's widely spoken of around the world in the West. What is really happening, and where could Indian knowledge systems and Indian traditions contribute to tackling this global pandemic of mental health crises?
Let's go back to wokeism. And one of the issues which comes up very often when we discuss that is this gender issue, and basically the idea which the antecedents of that go back partly to feminism. Okay, women want equal rights, which is a very laudable thing. But at some point, it became that women should be like men, that everything should be like men, that somehow, since there has been patriarchy, men have been that, they have been higher, or they have taken power. So now everybody should be like men. And that is really a kind of an asuric view of reality, because reality is complementary. Just as the inner and outer are complements of each other, male and female are complements of each other. The female is as valuable and important as male. And I think where the West has, by focusing on power, uh, and in more popular discourse right now, the dichotomy of oppressor and oppressed. So now everything is seen from a sense that the oppressed should be completely eliminated. So female should probably disappear. In fact, that's the reason why the greatest problem right now amongst teenagers in America is gender dysphoria amongst girls. Because somehow girls, there's a lot of indirect subliminal information going to their minds through the media and elsewhere, that look, there's something inferior about girls, right? Their menstruation, they have this or that. So they want to be boys. So they want their breasts to be chopped off. And a lot of doctors do it because they get money and so on, right? So I think this fundamental philosophical problem related to rejecting complementarity for the sake of a single minded acceptance only of physical reality of one entity or one conceptual entity of maleness, that if a whatever the oppressor does, now the oppressed should also do, and therefore there's only one thing. So everything is equal. Now in wokeism, maybe math is racist, and therefore now you're not going to let your kids, if your kid is very good at math, maybe it's subliminally through the epigenome, this person has an advantage. They might call it the Indic advantage or the Chinese advantage or the white advantage, white privilege or Chinese privilege or Indian privilege. So now we're going to hold every kid back so that there is the same outcome for every kid, no matter what their background or race. I think it's a kind of a racism, race obsession, which is leading to this mental illness. Because if you are obsessed.
And this is particularly interesting, Professor, because of course we know that in the progress of feminist thought, we were coming to the point where we were beginning to argue that yes, indeed, patriarchy is a problem, but the solution is not for women to become more like men. The solution is for women to be valued for what women bring to the table, not by emulating what men bring to the table, by respecting. And that is why things like, greater support for maternity came into being. That is why greater support for, ensuring that men play a equal part. I mean, all those progressive ideas came into being. And then, of course, like you're saying, it went into a different direction. This, gender sort of dysphoria and all kinds of other problems came into being. How does Indic knowledge systems tackle this?
Perhaps feminism, no matter how you defined it, was going to have a problem. Why? Because when populations are all rising, then clearly motherhood was a very important element. You had to keep the whole, population, humanity alive. But now when populations start to crash, if you go to South Korea, for example, if 100 people have only 35 kids or 34 kids, as the current total fertility rate indicates, then a lot of people don't have any children at all. Then the question of what is the specific role of women? This is also creating paradoxes and pressures. You see that? And now what has happened? How has the human body or human psyche responded to it? Well, as you know, right now in Japan and in Korea, a lot of young people say they are asexual. A lot of girls, maybe 1 in 2 or 1 in 3 in Korea and Japan, is never going to have a sexual encounter in their life. So the whole physiology or the experience that the body has is going to be changed. And as to where it will go, we don't know. But from one side, from the AI side, people would say, well, it's all for the good, because where the world is going is transhumanism. This will create the opening for technology to be integrated with the body. Maybe you'll bring in certain chips or certain other things, or memories could be invented, could be injected into the brain. Or maybe the future person would be only a certain fraction biologically, and a part of it will be in terms of AI. And then the transhumanists would say that such a person could probably be launched into space and would be able to seed life on places like the moon or the Mars or other things. Now, of course, this is all speculation or fantasy, but it's true that without going into such future, the present world itself has all kinds of paradoxes confronting it. And it's not clear what the resolution to each of these paradoxes is.
Can the lessons of the Vedanta, the Upanishads, the Indic knowledge systems play a role in us, in a sense, reclaiming a sense of identity, a higher identity, a more, many people, including me, believe that in a sense, Indian knowledge systems teach us the path and the process to higher selves, not just a material self, but a higher consciousness or a higher self or a higher way of being or more evolved way of being. It seems from everything that you're describing that this move towards a higher way of being is really, really important. It would enable us to retain control in a world where technology is determined to take control away from us. It will enable us to really, instead of being mere pawns to the ecosystem, it will enable us to be be people who actually continue as human beings to hold the reins of the ecosystem and technology. What intervention could Indian knowledge systems, including practices of meditation, of yoga, make in this ecosystem so that we could transition, or many of us could try and transition to higher and evolved states of being?
Oh, one way of looking at it is from the perspective of the four purusharthas that the tradition says, and they are dharma, which is morality and ethics, which people all over the world, good people all over the world would say that is fine, and artha, which is ambition, people all over the world would say that's fine. Then kama, desire, your ambition will come up only if you have desire, right? So all these are good things. We can bind humanity. But there's something that the West or the rest of the world doesn't have to the same measure, is this idea of moksha. Moksha is uniquely Indian. Moksha means freedom, mukti or freedom, and freedom from attachment. Because normally we attach our personal self to the contents of the mind. That is attachment. That is raga or anuraga, right? That's attachment. Now, if you're able to, or if you were able to separate yourself, separate the light from where it falls on the mind, then you'll realize that actually this light can have many different hues. And each of those hues is like a different state of consciousness. And those are the higher states of consciousness. And therefore, through those lights, you can see farther than what the average person does. Because the average person has access only to the memories and to the intellect, smriti and buddhi. And then, of course, on top of that is ahankar, the ego. And that ego is wrapped in a kind of a black box. One is not able to investigate that ego itself. And that's why people find it very hard to question themselves. But these practices, meditation or tantra, or whatever, help you go into that box and then become aware of different states of consciousness. So there's a whole ladder. And that's where you have different kinds of fulfillment that you obtain. So indeed, this whole system provides a universal way to people in all corners of the world to truly discover who they really are. Because normally we are only what our social role tells us. You go to school or college, you get a PhD or whatever else, you become a lecturer, but you're only doing various roles, or you're writing papers, you're creating a CV, but you're really not who you are. You don't know who you are, and that's why you're deeply unhappy. So how to go to that inner core of yourself, which brings you to happiness, because that happiness is not bound to a thing. So you are outside of time. That's why happiness ultimately is also para, is transcendent. So that has practices, different practices of yogic practices, where you can either follow Krishna in this great Bhagavad Gita, of bhakti or karma or jnana, right? Of different kinds of yoga. Or you can follow other practices of various tantric systems, or Kundalini, for example. And then raise your consciousness, which ultimately helps you detach yourself from the normal contents of the mind, which is generally the problem. So there are different practices, and people are quite aware of it. And some of these practices can also lead you to a sense of uh, elevated ego, which can be problematic. In every path there are dangers. So there can be a danger. You become egotistical, and you think you're the smartest person there is. But so long as one learns how to navigate one's path through this, this is beautiful to not only know oneself, to also relate to the world around oneself, and to be good for one's community and for humanity at large.
Finally, therefore, Professor, let me ask you one final question. From all that you're explaining to us, it occurs to me that perhaps we could argue, or we could agree that perhaps never before have Indian knowledge systems been so immediate and urgently relevant for us to take back our sense of self in the real world in today, not just for an evolved spiritual state of being, but even to retain a sort of mundane control of our own lives, with the dawn of technology that pervades every part of our lives, with the dawn of AI, as we're losing more and more control to technology, Indian knowledge systems and practices are more important for us to, even at a mundane level, to retain control of our mind and our lives. Would that be a correct assessment, Professor?
Oh, absolutely. You know, just as technology has become more pervasive and powerful, it surrounds us in every sense that one can imagine, it also has tremendous seductive power. That's the power of Maya, of technology. So it takes us from here to there. And in fact, a lot of people do nothing but surf the net the entire day because it's so seductive, it's beautiful. And in fact, there's this great dialogue in one of the Upanishads where I think where the dialogue, people between the asuras, the devas, and the manavas. The greatest danger that the devas possess is that of being seduced. The senses can be seduced. And I think this is going to get even worse. And I think this is where it's very important to remind oneself that, look, what is the larger picture? Who am I? And in that sense, the Indian knowledge system will be more relevant than ever before. Now, of course, we do know from history that the Indian yogis and rishis and sages and writers fanned out all across the ancient world, from Southeast Asia to Japan to China to the Slavic world 2,000 years ago. And these were people like you and me, and they spoke and convinced others that indeed there is good in this, which is good for you. And I think time has come, especially now, because the dangers of technology are so great. And we see that danger played out, especially on the streets of LA and San Francisco, where all these homeless people, are in their drug-induced higher states. So this, I think, would therefore be maybe central to where the world will go. Not only will it inform the average person as to how life is to be lived, it'll also inform the clever and the smart people who are actually creating technology or doing stuff at the frontiers, that here is where you need to go, because here is where there are going to be results which are going to be good for everybody. So it'll also help us pick what is right from what is wrong in the unfolding of technology itself.
Professor Subhash Kak, thanks very much for all your time. As always, really enlightening to talk to you. And heartiest congratulations once again on your new paper, as always, continuing to illuminate us. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, Hindol.